Number 11. Whale collision. A group of angry killer whales recently attacked a yacht off the coast of Portugal in what some have called quite an ordeal. A man named Pete Green, working with a yacht delivery company called Halcyon Yachts, was on board with 2 crew members and the owners of the yacht when the angry orcas attacked. They were sailing off the coast of Porto when they thought they saw dolphins playing in the water. As the animals got closer, they realized they were killer whales, and yes, they were coming right for them. The entire incident was recorded on video, and you can actually hear the whales ramming into the boat as if trying to smash it into pieces. After 2 hours of this, the killer whales finally stopped. In the end, no serious damage was done to the vessel in the attack. According to Newsweek, the attack was actually more like harassment. Nobody knows why these killer whales attacked the yacht, though there have been multiple reports coming in from the coasts of Portugal and Spain in which killer whales have been thrown into boat-attacking frenzies. Nobody's really sure why the killer whales are being so violent towards boats, though scientists have said that most of the attacks were probably carried out by juvenile killer whales. There's a good chance that the whales are simply cranky and going through whale puberty. Maybe it's a gang of delinquent orcas telling humans to stay off their turf. Number 10. Dark side of the yacht. If you've seen the show Below Deck, you know that working on a massive yacht isn't always champagne brunches and sunset cruises. It's a lot of hard work, and sometimes that lifestyle can be deadly. Sinead McNamara, a former super yacht hostess, was found hanged at the back of a $108 million super yacht she was working on in Greece. The Instagram model had been living the dream, sailing around the world for 4 years, but it wasn't exactly what it seemed like in the pictures. Just days before the incident, she was posting cryptic messages on social media and weird emojis. My head is all over the shop today. And take me back to where my only worry was not cracking my skull open. Looks like life on the sea took its toll on this girl. She would work 16 to 18-hour days and hardly sit down. Her job was to keep the living quarters in immaculate conditions and make up the cabin rooms for guests. She also served food and drinks to guests, did their laundry, and basically was on call for whatever they needed. And sometimes what guests needed was highly inappropriate. Prostitution and drug use was rampant. Before McNamara took her life, she called her mother and brother crying. She referred to an incident that took place on the yacht. There was a doctor on board that tried to resuscitate the girl, but to no avail. Greek officials were said to be reviewing texts and photographs found on her phone after crew members told police that she was struggling with a breakup. The cause of death was confirmed by a coroner to be hanging, but results of additional toxicology tests could take months to come back. Number 9. Lost at sea. A family from Santa Clarita went on the deadliest sailing trip in history. They were off the coast of New Zealand inside their yacht named the Melinda Lee, when a giant ship, possibly a type of freighter, crashed right into them. The massive cruise ship ripped the yacht into pieces and then drove on without even noticing what it had done. One of the children, Benjamin, went down with the yacht, and he was only 9 years old. His 7-year-old sister Anna and his parents Michael and Judith managed to scramble to a dinghy. But at some point, the little girl fell off the dinghy and vanished into the ocean. Her father dove in after her and he vanished as well, and neither of them was ever seen again. 62 hours after the horrific incident, Judith was rescued after washing up on a New Zealand beach. At the hospital, she gave police officials the details of how her fantasy trip ended in complete disaster and tragedy. According to the Los Angeles Times, it had been Judith and her husband's dream to quit their jobs and set sail. And they saw their dream come to life, but only Judith survived. And this brings up many questions. Why didn't the cruise ship see the family's yacht? Did those on board not have life jackets? Did the cruise ship just get away with it? And what do you make of this story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, give this video a like and then hit that subscribe button as well. Number 8. Hit by a ferry. As it turns out, yachts aren't even safe while innocently docked at the Marina. In 2005, a ferry in Vancouver, BC missed the terminal and plowed through dozens of unsuspecting boats and yachts sitting in the marina. The enormous vessel was trying to dock at the Horseshoe Bay terminal at 10 o'clock in the morning. When it missed its mark, it lost power and smashed right into Sewell's Harbor. In a news conference held after the accident, the president of BC Ferries told reporters that it was too early to say what had caused the crash, but that it was probably something mechanical. Canadian Coast Guard divers searched the waters around the wrecked ferry for over 2 hours, trying to find any lost victims. Luckily, they didn't find any bodies, and there appeared to be no injuries. None of the 554 passengers were hurt. But the same can't be said for the dozens of defenseless boats that were run over and destroyed. Number 7. Drunken Disorderly. A drunken disorderly yacht pilot bit off a little more than he could chew when he tried to dock his boat after consuming way too much whiskey. According to the Herald Tribune, the man was spotted by patrons at the Marina. They noticed he was driving erratically and trying to dot his 40-foot Carver yacht. The boat was enormous, and the guy driving it was literally so drunk that he couldn't figure out how to park it properly. This resulted in the drunk captain crashing into a bunch of boats at the Marina. He was quickly arrested by the Sarasota Police Department, and according to their arrest report, the man was 32-year-old Brandon Corey Sheridan. When in custody, he could hardly speak and refused a field sobriety test. He was then charged with boating under the influence and property damage. And when he finally took a breathalyzer test, it was determined that he had 2.3 times the level of alcohol in his blood system that a person needs to be considered impaired. Yo-ho-ho indeed. Number 6. The Murder Boat. One of the worst yachting disasters in history happened on a yacht named the Well-Deserved. But you can kind of bet what happened wasn't well-deserved, as really no one should have to go through this. It started as a missing persons case years ago in 2004, but then turned into a high-profile murder investigation. The mastermind behind what happened on the yacht was Skylar Delian and his wife Jennifer. They were working with John Kennedy, a Long Beach gang member. The trio had planned to steal the yacht owned by Tom and Jackie Hawks, but the plan didn't exactly work out the way they'd hoped. Tom and Jackie did want to sell their yacht. This was when Delaton, who had played in the TV series Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, took interest. 3 weeks after Tom and Jackie disappeared, police noticed suspicious activity going on with their bank accounts. Delian and his wife were trying to access them. That was when officers learned that Delian was on probation for a previous armed robbery. Officers also learned that Tom and Jackie had given power of attorney over to Delian, which made absolutely no sense. The investigation went on until early 2005, and it was revealed that Skylar and Jennifer Delian had murdered the couple on their own boat with John Kennedy. They had lured Tom and Jackie out to sea and then forced them to sign legal documents turning over ownership of the boat and giving them power of attorney. The gang then tossed Tom and Jackie overboard, and their bodies have never been found. Number 5. Kidnapped in Asia. A Canadian yachtsman named John Ridsdale was living and working in the Philippines when he ran into a bit of trouble while on board a 42-foot catamaran, the Aziza. At the same time, another Canadian man named Robert Hall, along with a Filipino woman named Maritz Flor, were nearby on the yacht Renova. These people were all kidnapped by a militant group known as Abu Sayyaf that attacked the Marina and then held their hostages at ransom for $6.5 million each. The hostages were transported to the island of Jolo, and a video message was released showing the captives. These people had been enjoying a perfectly ordinary day at the Marina, enjoying their yachting lives in peace and happiness, and the gang snatched them right off their boats and completely ruined their lives. John ended up being beheaded not long after the video was released, and 9 months later, so was Robert Hall. The only one who made it out was Hall's Filipina girlfriend. And believe it or not, this is actually a huge danger to people yachting all around the world. Pirates are more prevalent in some places today than they were in the 1600s. Number 4. Knocked overboard. An unnamed man learned the hard way in 2021 that yachting is not easy. Wait a minute. Who said it was easy? While yachting on Lake Macquarie on a relaxing Sunday in February, this guy was hit by the boom on the sailing boat and knocked actually overboard. This is something that you only ever see in movies. The boom swung out, smacked the guy extremely hard in the torso, and he was swept off the boat and into the sea. He then drowned because the other people on board the yacht weren't able to lower the sails in time to stop the vessel. The boat just kept on going, and the guy who got knocked overboard couldn't be found, and he was nowhere near land. A Westpac rescue helicopter arrived shortly after and pulled the poor yachtsman out of the water, but unfortunately, he was unable to be resuscitated by the rescue workers. Number 3. Lost at sea. In March of 2019, a distress call went out by the SY Paradise, a 60-foot yacht that offers cruises throughout the South Atlantic from the Antarctic to the Falkland Islands. The yacht had capsized after getting smashed into by a massive wave during brutal weather conditions out at sea. The yacht had been cruising from South Georgia to Uruguay. During the violent storm, 2 people were swept overboard. After the boat capsized, it managed to right itself. The 6 remaining passengers had somehow clung hold of the vessel while it literally did a backflip in the water. One of the passengers suffered a head injury and needed to be evacuated to the hospital. But as for the 2 unfortunate yachters who were knocked overboard during the attack of the wave, they were never found again. Number 2. Unlucky billionaire. It's hard to feel bad for anyone who has billions of dollars, and yet recently, a billionaire made the news when his 130-foot mega yacht named the MY Song fell off a cargo ship and was destroyed. The yacht had a price tag on it of a whopping $38 million. It was on its way to be delivered to the Caribbean when it toppled overboard, apparently because the crew had not secured the vessel properly. Its owner is an Italian rich guy named Pierluigi Loro Piana, who has a net worth of roughly $1.6 billion according to Fox News. He told local newspapers that losing his yacht was like his home burning down. But again, it's kind of hard to feel sorry for someone who can buy a yacht for $38 million like a normal person might buy a morning cup of coffee. The yacht was eventually located out at sea and prepared to be towed, though it's definitely going to require some major repairs. But for this Italian billionaire, that likely won't be a problem. Number 1. Mummified yachter. A few years ago, the mummified body of a German sailor was found on a yacht floating off the coast of the Philippines. The body was found by fishermen that went aboard the deserted vessel. They immediately alerted authorities. The police then managed to identify the corpse as Manfred Fritz Bajoret, and he was 59 years old. The police also said that they suspected no foul play, but they couldn't say exactly how Manfred had perished. A forensic criminologist reasoned that it could have been from an ordinary heart attack. Manfred was discovered sitting at the desk in the radio room, leaning on his arm as if he'd fallen asleep. His body was totally mummified, and nobody knows how long he'd been like that, but it could have been up to a year. Manfred had been sailing across the planet for the past 20 years before his death. And as for why he was found so well preserved, experts say it was due to the dry ocean winds, the hot temperatures, and of course all the salt in the air. He was literally found petrified and probably could have remained perfectly preserved for years to come. A woman from New Zealand named Karen Lang couldn't let her Tinder date go. She was 32 years old and was just sentenced to jail for 2 years and 3 months on a pair of charges of criminal harassment and threatening to kill. According to the New Zealand Herald, Karen had a long, dark history before being sentenced, of stalking her victim after a Tinder date that went horribly wrong. The date ended with Karen breaking down her date's door and assaulting him quite violently. It's not clear exactly what happened on the date, but it's safe to say that Karen was in no way satisfied. A psychologist's report read to the court during the trial revealed that Karen had been desperate to find someone to love her. When her Tinder date refused the loving, Karen went totally psycho. She went so far as to target her date's mother on Facebook, sending at least 13 threatening messages. One of the messages read, "My feelings are to murder you and I will enjoy it because I don't like you. I'm gonna get you for what you've done." Yikes, Karen! Now Karen is stuck behind bars for stalking and threats of violence. She's currently being given counseling and hopefully when she gets out, she doesn't get back on Tinder. Number 9. First time pregnant. Being alone in a new city is rough. How do you meet people? Is Tinder really the best option? Not for this next girl. The first time Caitlin had a Tinder date, she got pregnant. It was the very first person she'd ever matched with. Apparently, they matched a little too well. They began to casually date. They'd obviously not been very safe, and a couple of months later, Caitlin realized she had a baby inside of her. The one thing you're not supposed to do on a random Tinder date is get pregnant. And to make this story even crazier, when Caitlin realized that she was pregnant, she sat the would-be father down and dumped him. Not only that, but she sat him down, told him she didn't want to raise the baby with him, and that she was going to abort it. Well, Caitlin never went through with canceling the pregnancy. Instead, she decided to carry her baby all the way through and then put it up for adoption. For the next 7 months, Caitlin struggled living alone in a city where she had no friends and was pregnant all by herself. After the birth, Caitlin's son was handed over to his adoptive family and thus ended what is the longest and most emotional first Tinder experience in history. Number 8. An organized robbery. In what was one of the most brutal catfish dates ever, 2 men looking for love on Tinder ended up being terrorized by a pair of grown men and a teenage girl. Josinga McDonald and Jeremiah Manny were denied bail by a Cook County judge after being charged with vehicular hijacking, aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated robbery. These two guys posed as a woman online and lured two unwitting victims to a predetermined place to be robbed. The first victim was lured into a home and downstairs into the basement by a woman he thought was his date, but she was just the bait. When the victim got into the basement, there were 4 men in ski masks waiting for him, and one of them was armed with a handgun. After beating him senseless, they emptied his pockets and stole his car. When the second victim from Tinder arrived to meet his date, he was instead greeted by 2 men who punched him in the face, beat him senseless, threatened to kill him if he screamed or ran away, and then drove him to an ATM to withdraw money, and then to a gas station to buy cigars and alcohol with the victim's credit card. Then they kicked the man out of his own car and stole his wallet. Of course, the victim this time was able to trace his cell phone and call the police. The police followed his cell phone straight to the robbers, who were still sitting in his car with all the stolen goods. Are any of these stories making you think about deleting your Tinder app yet? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Number 7. A savage kidnapping. A woman recently suffered the Tinder date from hell. According to the Sudbury police, after meeting a man named Peter from the dating app, this poor woman was kidnapped, beaten, strangled, and threatened. Her insane Tinder date not only threatened to kill her, but do the same to her child if she ever told the authorities what he did to her. The most bizarre part is that Peter, only 28 years old, kidnapped the woman and held her hostage inside of his parents' house. His parents even saw her in the morning at around 6 a.m., and they asked her if she was okay, and she said she was fine, but only because she was scared of what Peter might do. In a later interview, the father of the attacker told Boston 25 News that had he known what his son was up to, he would have called the police right away. In the end, she ended up escaping the psycho's house and fleeing to the nearby LaHaye Hospital to get treatment for her injuries. She then told the police what happened, and Peter is now being charged with a whole lot of crimes, including assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, assault and battery on a police officer, and of course, kidnapping and strangulation. Number 6. Breaking protocol. A man got himself in some seriously hot water trying to go on a Tinder date in the middle of the pandemic. First of all, is dating really your top priority when the world seems to be falling apart? Apparently for some it is. This guy decided he was going to be traveling by air to meet a girl he'd been talking to on Tinder. Well, when he landed in the East Midlands airport in the United Kingdom, he found himself in quite the pickle. Not only did he get in trouble at the airport for breaching strict lockdown protocols, but he was also caught trying to smuggle a small amount of drugs on his person. This genius never ended up making it to his Tinder date and instead spent his romantic evening with the police. He was arrested, but it hasn't been revealed what kind of charges the man faces. And as far as his Tinder date, well, she's probably moved on by now. Number 5. 9,000 texts. A Tinder user from Australia has been accused of stalking a guy that she matched with on the dating app. But not only did she stalk her ex-match, she's also accused of stalking the guy's sisters, his new girlfriend, and his parents. As reported by Newsweek, this woman sent over 9,000 text messages in a campaign of harassment that went on for months. It all started when Denise Lee met Matthew Hoberton in 2015. After a brief relationship, Matthew moved out of the city. Later, Denise learned that Matthew had a new girlfriend. He was dating a girl from the University of Melbourne. After she saw pictures of them together on Facebook, well, she went a little nuts. In fact, prosecutors have described what happened in the following months as nothing but vicious. Matthew was constantly blocking numbers and switching his own, but the harassment continued and got even more ugly. Denise targeted 6 individuals and sent over 9,000 texts and 100 emails from different fake accounts. The vicious attacks went so far that one of the people involved was contemplating doing something desperate with their own life. Now Denise is facing charges involving using a service to harass, which is an Australian cybercrime. She's also facing 2 counts of stalking, along with 2 counts of contravening an apprehended violence order. This is pretty grim behavior, especially considering Denise is a radiologist and a fairly normal member of society, or so it seemed. Her stalking went so far that she followed Matthew around and took pictures of his extended family, even tracking Matthew's movements through his cycling app. Number 4. Catfish carjacking. 5 teenagers were recently arrested for a string of robberies and carjackings in San Jose that were done using fake accounts on the Tinder app. According to the San Jose Police Department, 5 youngsters between the ages of 15 and 19 were arrested for the crimes that took place between March 16th and March 29th. The fraudulent Tinder accounts were used to lure male victims to parks or secluded streets in the late hours of the evening, where the victims were then beaten and carjacked at gunpoint by masked teenage catfish. Luckily, nobody was seriously injured in any of these cases. All of the suspects were captured and charged with multiple criminal offenses. It's not clear, though, how many men were tricked into getting their cars stolen or if any of them got their vehicles back. But one thing is for sure, the victims are probably never going to meet strangers in the dark ever again. Number 3. The double life. Caitlin met a boy on Tinder and they started dating, but things got a little weird when her date vanished after 3 months. Caitlin thought this guy was the total package. She said he was well-mannered, he owned his own farm, and he even had a super cute golden retriever. He seemed perfect. But then he ghosted Caitlin out of the blue, only to re-establish contact a little while later. He told Caitlin that he needed to go to London because his friend was having a baby. Caitlin thought this was a little weird, so she used the geotag attached to the X-rated pictures that her date had sent her to see just where this guy was from and what he was really doing. Using the geotags, she matched her date's name to the place he lived and found pictures of his wedding. It turned out this guy was married and cheating on his wife. He even had kids. This guy was living a double life, but Caitlin was a good person, and even though he definitely deserved it, she didn't ruin his marriage or his relationship with his kids by outing him as a dirtbag to the world. What would you do if you found yourself in this kind of situation? Would you leave it alone? Would you maybe warn his wife? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Number 2. Banned for stalking. It does take a lot to get banned by Tinder, and yet one man from Australia was such a creep that the dating app actually blocked him because he'd been stalking and harassing women. Well, we know this guy's name. It's Thomas, a 29-year-old who was caught intimidating at least 7 different women from different cities throughout Australia. But women as far away as London also had problems with this guy. According to the Daily Mail, this man's very handsome and he has a good job. And he uses his good looks to lure his victims into uncomfortable situations, where he then sometimes stalks and belittles them. Well, after getting kicked off Tinder, Thomas was caught using another dating app called Bumble, but one of his previous victims caught him on the other dating app as well. And while he hasn't been kicked off just yet, there is a countrywide warning for women to stay away from him because he's an absolute psycho. Imagine being such a bad date that you become despised by an entire country. Number 1. Lured and dismembered. A 24-year-old Nebraska woman is the winner of the worst Tinder date in history. Sydney Loof was murdered while on a date with a woman she had met off the dating app. Sydney was lured to the apartment of Bailey Boswell and her boyfriend Aubrey Trail on November 15th of 2017. Boswell had used the app to lull Sydney into a false sense of security. But when Sydney arrived at the apartment, her phone was turned off and she was killed just a few minutes later. Boswell and her boyfriend then chopped Sydney into at least 13 pieces with a hacksaw and tin snips that they had bought from Home Depot just a couple hours before the date. The whole thing had been premeditated. This deranged couple then dumped Sydney's body along country roads. Of course, Sydney's remains were quickly discovered by police. The Tinder killers were captured and found guilty of first-degree murder. The most horrendous part of this whole story, though, is that nobody knows why the couple did what they did. There was no sensible motive to the violence that occurred. On July 20th, 2012, about a half hour into the midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises at the Century 16 movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, a man dressed in tactical clothing rose from the front row, set off tear gas grenades, and fired 76 shots into the audience using numerous assault weapons. Of the 400 people inside the theater, 12 were killed and 70 were injured. 58 of them by gunfire and 12 others in the scramble to escape. Police rushed to the scene and within minutes arrested the assailant, who was wearing a load-bearing vest, a gas mask, a ballistic helmet, and bullet-resistant leggings. Beneath all the gear, the shooter's hair was dyed bright red and he reportedly referred to himself as the Joker. His real name is James Holmes, and his calm and disconnected demeanor during his arrest just added to the bizarre aspects of his crime. Police found his apartment booby-trapped with explosive devices, including 30 homemade hand grenades wired to a control box in the kitchen. In 2015, prosecutors turned down Holmes' offer to plead guilty in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was found guilty of 24 counts of first-degree murder, 140 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and 1 count of possessing illegal explosives. His family pleaded for him to be spared from the death penalty, claiming that Holmes is severely mentally ill. Jurors failed to reach a unanimous decision regarding the death penalty, resulting in 12 life sentences without parole for Holmes. In 2018, William H. Reed, one of the court-appointed psychiatrists who spoke with Holmes at length about his crimes, wrote a book about his experience interacting with the criminal called A Dark Night in Aurora, Inside James Holmes and the Colorado Theater Shootings. In an interview with the Associated Press, he admitted that the book's conclusion about the inner workings of the murderer's mind might disappoint readers, stating the answer, and this really is the answer, but it's not very satisfying, lies in an unimaginably detailed and complex confluence that we just can't replicate, because we can't see all of it. A big part of it is it's hidden in Holmes's mind, and he can't see it either. Number 7. Identity fraud from beyond the grave. In February 1992, a patient who called himself Thomas Hughes had a heart attack and passed away at Danbury Hospital in Connecticut. Hospital staff soon discovered that all the identifying information the man gave them was false, leading them and detectives around the country on a seemingly endless search to determine his real identity. Weeks before his death, the patient had checked into an Allentown, Pennsylvania hospital as Thomas White. He was later connected to hospitals in Rhode Island, California, and elsewhere, where he provided various names and stories, including that he was a Persian Gulf hero and one of the world's 40 stained glass artisans who were trained at the Vatican, the Morning Call reported. In addition to using false names, the mysterious patient gave fake social security numbers, addresses, and employers. He stayed at each hospital for several days before sneaking out in the middle of the night, knowing the bill would never reach him. Before he died, the man made several phone calls to attorneys with apparent plans to sue for injuries. No family members immediately came forward to identify the man, who mental health experts theorized might have been homeless, perhaps checking into hospitals using fake identities to get free shelter and meals. They also entertained the possibility that he had a mental illness that caused him to constantly seek medical care for real or imagined ailments. When the case aired on Unsolved Mysteries in 1993, viewers recognized the patient as Thomas Patrick White. It's believed that he suffered from Munchausen syndrome, a condition that causes a healthy person to constantly seek medical treatments by deliberately causing or exaggerating their symptoms. Number 6. Luna Park Ghost Train Fire. One night in June 1979, the Ghost Train roller coaster at the Luna Park amusement park in New South Wales, Australia, erupted into flames, killing 6 young boys and 1 father. Officials ultimately classified the fire as accidental despite numerous eyewitness accounts from park visitors who overheard a suspicious leather and denim-clad group of teenage boys talking about using kerosene and matches at around the same time smoke began pouring from the ride. One bystander, Les Dowd, immediately went to the police and gave a statement, which he claimed in a recent ABC interview that he was pressured to recant. Speaking publicly for the first time since the incident nearly 42 years ago, he said, "I heard one of them say, 'I spread the kerosene out, and I lit it with a match.' Another one said, 'You're a fool for doing it.' They started running towards the exit." Another park visitor named Tina Shakeshaft claims that the police pressured her to deviate from her statement, which was very similar to Dowd's. She refused and they eventually relented, but Shakeshaft was never summoned to testify at a judicial inquiry and was among 26 witnesses described as taking the inquiry no further. A search for the criminals was abruptly called off the following evening. The news broadcast claimed that the police found no suspicious circumstances, even though by then they had received eyewitness accounts of the adolescents and their discussion about using an accelerant to light the ghost train on fire. Even the park superintendent, Alan Chappell, had told of reprimanding a group of youths matching the description of the suspects earlier that evening, and the ride's operator recalled seeing them enter the queue minutes before the fire broke out. But these stories have allegedly fallen on deaf ears, and the suspects were never found after barely being searched for. The disturbing event is the subject of a new ABC documentary called Exposed: The Ghost Train Fire, which is finally giving overlooked witnesses a chance to speak out about what they saw and heard. But their decision to open up comes at a cost. Dowd, Shakeshaft, and others describe living in fear, constantly looking over their shoulders, and wondering if the criminals will ever catch up to them for daring to break their silence. Why do you think this incident has been kept so hush-hush? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 5. The disappearance of Margie Jelovsik. Margie Jelovsik was a young widow managing a tavern in Gary, Indiana, when she met a high-ranking motorcycle gang member named Randy Mad Yeager in 1996. The two hit it off, and unbeknownst to Maggie at first, Yeager had an extensive criminal record. Furthermore, he and several other members of the outlaw Chicago gang were under federal investigation for a laundry list of additional crimes, including racketeering, drug dealing, and murder. Margie's behavior changed in concerning ways as her relationship with Yeager progressed. She distanced herself from family, and when Yeager and 17 other suspects were indicted for their crimes, she became even more devoted to him. Instead of fleeing from the obvious red flags right in front of her, Margie stood by her man, even after he went on the run from the law. She became paranoid that she was under surveillance and constantly feared that the authorities would catch up to Yeager. Several months later, Margie vanished, leaving behind her car, luggage, personal effects, and the inhaler that she relied on for treating her asthma. The woman's family suspected that Yeager had kidnapped Margie, but law enforcement was not so quick to assume that her disappearance was voluntary. The U.S. Marshals Service finally caught up with the pair in 2014 after tracking them down in Mexico, where they had apparently been living for 17 years. Yeager was taken into custody, but Maggie unfortunately died after leading authorities on a high-speed chase and crashing the vehicle she was driving. Number 4. A clever con man. Psychological manipulation is arguably one of the most overlooked but dangerous weapons criminals sometimes use to pull off their dirty deeds. This was certainly the case when a con man named Terry Tilley was convinced of swindling 3 generations of a wealthy aristocratic French family out of their $5 million fortune. Starting as far back as the 1990s, Tilley convinced 11 members of the de Vadrines family that they were targets of a sinister Masonic plot that only he could save them from, with his alleged high-ranking connections as a secret agent and a descendant of Austro-Hungarian nobility. After programming his victims with collective paranoia, Tilley helped himself to their money, properties, jewels, and artwork. To this day, nobody knows what became of the money or valuables. And the brainwashed victims became increasingly withdrawn over time, eventually barricading themselves inside their ancestral home, which French authorities seized in 2007 after they stopped paying their taxes. From there, the group went from one suburban home to another, living in anonymity and remaining sequestered from the outside world. Fearing for their lives, they eventually relocated to the UK at Tilley's urging. At one point, when a family member doubted Tilley's authenticity, he was accused of being involved in a network of evil and subsequently banished. Tilley also turned the group against another relative, Christine, whom he beat, humiliated, and threatened in an attempt to acquire a key he believed she had to a secret family fortune, which didn't actually exist. Christine fled back to France in 2009, and reported the bizarre events to authorities. Tilley was arrested, but it took the rest of the family several months of deprogramming with the help of a cult expert to realize the gravity of the man's actions against them. From there, they focused on rebuilding their lives from scratch and regaining some semblance of normalcy while Tilley was shipped off to prison to serve a 10-year well-deserved sentence for his crimes. Number 3. Forgotten identity following strange disappearance. Imagine waking up on a roadside in an unfamiliar place and having no idea where you are. That's what happened to a man named Pierre in 1992, when he woke up in a California ditch and couldn't think of anyone to call for help from a payphone. All he had with him was a blue duffel bag, and the only clue to his possible identity was a Boston library card for someone named Pierre April. The man's only memories were of San Diego, located 400 miles north of where he regained consciousness, and his recollection was foggy at best. With just $17 in his pocket, the confused wanderer hitchhiked to San Diego, hoping to regain his memory. But when he got there, he did not recognize his surroundings. A bus driver took him to a homeless shelter. An exhaustive test led experts to believe his amnesia was genuine and trauma-induced, although they admitted it's highly unusual for someone to suffer from the condition as long as Pierre had. Bits and pieces of his memory returned over time, including visions of a woman named Carol, who he believed was a former co-worker, but composite drawings initially failed to yield any fruitful connections. Finally, upon seeing the case on Unsolved Mysteries, a former co-worker named Carol called the show's telecenter and identified the man as a Canadian citizen named Pierre April, as his library card had indicated. Pierre's family said that he was missing for at least 5 months before they learned of his whereabouts. Thankfully, after reuniting with his loved ones and looking at photos and other things from the past, Pierre's memory returned. But the details surrounding his disappearance remain largely unknown to this day. So what do you think happened to Pierre? Number 2. A likable killer. Bernie Tiede was a well-liked community member with a reputation for being friendly, helpful, and down-to-earth. It was with this manipulative charm that the Texas mortician found an unlikely companion in a woman named Marjorie Nugent when he helped arrange her husband's funeral in 1990. The two soon became inseparable, despite the wealthy widow being over 40 years his senior. Bernie disinherited Nugent's only son, Rod, from her will the following year and became the sole inheritor of her $10 million estate, as well as her power of attorney. In 1996, after 9 months of not being able to reach his mother, Rod traveled to the area and had her declared as missing. Upon entering her home, Rod discovered his mother's dead body in a freezer. She'd been shot to death. Bernie admitted to killing Nugent and storing her body in a freezer when he was brought in for questioning the year after she disappeared. He claimed Nugent was controlling and emotionally abusive and that he murdered her in a dissociative state resulting from childhood sexual abuse at the hands of his uncle. The argument initially didn't work, and in 1999, Bernie was sentenced to life in prison, but he was released on $10,000 bail in 2014, based on his claims of murdering Nugent in an abuse-induced dissociative state. 2 years later, an unconvinced jury re-sentenced Bernie to 99 years to life. Throughout his various trials and sentencings, several community members spoke highly of Bernie's character, describing him as likable and generous, despite the allegations against him and the overwhelming evidence that he was guilty. Number 1. Russian sex slave. In recent years, rumors have circulated on social media claiming that in 2014, a Russian hairdresser named Olga Zajac overpowered a man who attempted to burglarize her business and steal her earnings. This happened in the town of Meshchovsk, located 155 miles from Moscow. The story alleges that Zajac beat the intruder, named Victor, stripped him naked, tied him to a radiator, force-fed Viagra to him, and kept him as a sex slave for 3 days. Zajac supposedly took mercy on Victor after sexually assaulting him for 3 days and released him on the condition that he would not report her to law enforcement. But he broke his promise and went to the police, who arrested him for burglary and charged Zajac with kidnapping and sexual assault. Those who had the presence of mind to fact-check these claims found it difficult to determine whether or not the story was true due to the scarcity of reliable information available about the alleged ordeal. The website Weird World Wire looked into the matter and learned that the story supposedly appeared in a local paper and then went viral after being picked up by foreign media. But that this kind of thing happens all the time in Russia and nobody really cared. In the end of the day, the site was no more successful than anyone else in its attempt to verify the story, which also has not been disproven. Martin Pistorius fell into a coma in the late 1980s at the young age of only 12. Martin remained in his coma, locked in a vegetative state. For 12 long years he was in this coma. That's as long as he had already been alive. Doctors could not pinpoint what caused the boy's illness. They suspected it could have been cryptococcal meningitis, and physicians were positive that Martin would soon die. Nonetheless, his parents cared for him the entire time. They even had an alarm set for every 2 hours so they could turn Martin in his bed, and that prevented him from getting sores. This went on for 12 long and very difficult years. And then Martin woke up. The craziest part about Martin eventually waking up is that now he claims that he remembers a lot of what happened while he was in this vegetative coma. He recalls being trapped inside his coma as being stuck inside his body with no ability to communicate or move. It was a living nightmare. Martin even wrote a book about his experience, and in his book, he claims that after about 2 years of being a vegetable, he gradually began to wake up. He then spent the next 10 years as a ghost. His mind was awake, but his body was still in a coma. He heard what people said, and he lived every day in utter misery. But now he's miraculously very much awake and doing much better. Number 9. 27 years asleep. A woman named Munira Abdullah from the United Arab Emirates was injured in a car accident back in 1991. For the next 27 years, she lay dormant in a coma. At the time of her accident, Munira was only 32 years old. She'd been in a car that crashed into a bus on her way to pick up her child from school. The accident gave her a severe brain injury that resulted in her coma. At the time, her son Omar was only 4 years old. But one day, Manira woke up. After bouncing between hospitals in London and the UAE and Germany, she finally regained consciousness in 2018 after years of treatment and surgeries. Omar, who is now almost the same age his mother was at the time of the accident, was there to see her stir from her very long sleep. And while she wasn't immediately cognitive and fully aware, she did seem to be pulling out of her vegetative state. Omar said in an interview, "I never gave up on her because I always had a feeling that one day she would wake up." Now Manira is in Abu Dhabi, where she is currently undergoing intense physiotherapy to improve her posture, to prevent her muscles from being damaged, and to try and live some kind of normal life. According to the BBC, cases like this are very rare. Almost nobody recovers consciousness after being that long inside a coma, and even fewer people go on to lead any kind of normal life. Most people who regain consciousness after long comas have serious disabilities because of all the damage that has been done to their brain. Number 8. The Pandemic Awakening. A British teenager named Joseph Laville was struck by a car on March 1st, 2020. At the time, the United Kingdom only had about 23 cases of a strange and new virus. After Joseph was hit by the car, he fell into a coma that ended up lasting for 10 whole months. Almost a year later, Joseph was recovering in a changed world. When he had gone into his coma, everything was completely normal. But when he woke up, he found himself living in a dystopian fantasy. The world was different, everything was closed, and the entire social fabric had been altered. To make matters even worse for Joseph and his family, his mother had only been able to visit him in the hospital throughout the pandemic from a distance, dressed from her head to her toe in special protective equipment. And even though Joseph woke up from his coma and was transferred to a care home to recover, his mother is still waiting until she gets the green light just to touch her son for the first time in a year. The lucky part for Joseph is that he pretty much managed to escape a lot of fear the pandemic caused at the beginning. There will be a crappy spot where the pandemic had ruined everyone else's lives, but not his. If he had to be going into a coma at some point, 2020 was probably the best year to do it. What part of 2020 would you be happiest to forget? Let me know in the comments, and then don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 7. The Wrong Life. Alpha Kabija from the United Kingdom was riding his bike when he got hit by a van so hard that his brain was knocked out of place inside of his skull. Alpha was in a precarious state and needed to be medically induced into a coma. This coma lasted for 3 weeks. Before he was woken up, doctors told his family that he probably wouldn't remember anything that happened before the accident, including his own identity. Doctors basically said he would probably have amnesia, but instead of amnesia, Alpha woke up with someone else's memories. He apparently remembered that he had a girlfriend who was pregnant with twins. He could even remember the names he had picked out for his twins. He told his family that he could remember the day of his accident, saying that he was on his way to see his girlfriend after he had just completed a job interview. This guy also thought that he owned a private plane. Man. None of these memories were true, but they also didn't belong to someone else. There was no paranormal nonsense going on here. The memories had been fantasized, probably inside of his mind during the coma. His subconscious had somehow merged his real life with a fictitious life that he dreamed up for himself. Number 6. Chicken fillet coma. A spectacular miracle recently unfolded in Taiwan when a young teenager who'd been trapped in a coma for 62 days woke up after his brother offhandedly mentioned chicken fillets. As it turned out, chicken fillet was the teenager's favorite food. He apparently liked it so much that just hearing about it woke him up from his coma. This poor kid had been in a serious scooter accident just months before and had suffered serious bleeding inside his organs and slipped into a very deep coma. He'd been in the intensive care unit ever since. He'd gone under the knife at least 6 times for operations, including to repair his liver and kidney and to fix issues with his cranium. But despite all the surgeries, he was not waking up. It wasn't until while his older brother was visiting the hospital and said to him, "I'm gonna eat your favorite chicken fillet," that the boy sprang to life as if released from a spell. I guess those were the magic words. The teen has since recovered and been discharged from the hospital. Number 5. Coma after birth. Famous YouTuber Grace Victory had a very tough few months. First, she got infected with COVID-19. Then she gave birth. She was actually induced into labor 2 months early because of the virus. Just a single day after giving birth to her son, Grace was put into a medically induced coma. This happened on Christmas of all days. and it took 3 months for the British YouTuber to be pulled out of the coma, at which point she finally met her son, already 3 months old. Grace had been put into the coma because of respiratory issues. When she was admitted to the intensive care unit on Christmas Day, she couldn't breathe. The only way to help her recover from the virus was to put her into the coma, allowing her body to rest. And Grace is now awake and back online. Number 4. Birth in a coma. Speaking of comas and babies, a Canadian woman from British Columbia needed to be placed into a medically induced coma because of COVID-19 complications. Just like Grace Victory, she too had been pregnant. The biggest difference with Gillian McIntosh was that she had her baby while still in the coma, which you might not even believe is possible. She was completely passed out and unconscious when she delivered her son Travis. It wasn't for a full month until she was taken out of her coma, at which time she was shocked to discover that her son was already a month old. She hadn't even known the gender, and she could hardly even remember that she had been pregnant in the first place. And when the doctors told her what happened, she was quite surprised. Luckily, there was no long-lasting damage to her brain. Gillian was discharged from the hospital after waking up from her coma on Christmas Eve and arrived home to find her son waiting there for her along with her husband. Talk about a Christmas miracle. Everyone in the family is now happy and healthy. Number 3. 39 years later. Jean-Pierre Adams never woke up from his coma. It's been 39 years. Adams was once a French international footballer on his way to becoming a legendary athlete. Then he suffered a minor knee injury in 1981. The procedure to fix his knee was only estimated to put the sports star out of action for a couple months. However, a dangerous dose of anesthetic left him trapped in a coma he's still in today. 39 years is one of the longest times that a person has ever been kept in a vegetative state. Today, Adams is 73 years old. The anesthesiologist who caused his coma in the first place went to court in 1990 and was given a 1-month suspended sentence and a bit of a fine, but otherwise got to live the rest of his life pretty normally. Adams has been cared for by his wife for the past almost 40 years, and she continues to refuse to pull the plug. This is despite people insisting that pulling the plug might be the right thing to do, especially after such a long time with such a bleak outlook for the future. Even though he's in a vegetative state, Adams is still able to eat and apparently hear. He has a completely normal routine, waking up in the morning to eat and then sitting around all day in his wheelchair. But even if Adams ever wakes up, the experts say he will not recognize anyone and would probably not remember any details of his life. Number 2. Spanish learnings. Ruben Nismoa got a concussion when he was just 16 years old. The concussion was so serious that he ended up in a coma. This all happened just because of a soccer game. The Atlanta teen was kicked in the head by another player during the game. But the coma didn't prove deadly. Ruben did eventually wake up, but when he did, he found he had an ability that he had never known about. He was suddenly fluent in Spanish. According to the report from CNN, Ruben had been able to speak a little bit of Spanish, but nothing fluent. After waking up from his coma, he could speak perfect Spanish like he was a native speaker. This is something known as foreign accent syndrome, and it's a rare condition in which some kind of brain injury causes a change to a person's speech pattern. It can either give someone a new accent or apparently miraculously teach them how to speak another language entirely. The first case of this came in 1941, when a Norwegian woman suffered a brain injury during a German bombing incident and woke up with a German accent. Another incident of this happened a few years ago, when a Navy veteran passed out in his motel and woke up with no memory of his old life, and he could only speak Swedish. To this day, there have been less than a few dozen reported cases, and none of them make much sense to mainstream scientists. Number 1. Terry Wallace. Terry Wallace is considered the longest ever coma survivor. It was 1984 and Terry was only 19 years old when he and 2 of his friends flew off a small bridge in their pickup truck and landed in a dry riverbed. The crash left Terry unresponsive and essentially brain dead. He was in a vegetative state, and doctors gave him virtually no chance of ever recovering. However, Terry soon entered what is known as a minimally conscious state, according to the report from the New York Times. This diagnosis meant that Terry could track things with his eyes. He could sometimes respond by blinking or grunting, and he was vaguely aware of some things. Terry spent the next 19 years sitting inside of a nursing home with family members visiting him occasionally. One of his visitors included his daughter, who had been only 6 weeks old at the time he went into a coma. Then, after 19 years, Terry suddenly became aware. He began speaking out of nowhere. He could remember people and faces. He began to make a recovery, and to this day, Terry is alive and doing relatively well. He spends most of his day in bed listening to music, but he's awake and he can speak and understand most of what's going on. He's been studied by doctors all over the world, interviewed by news crews from all over the country and abroad, and is living a pretty good life now considering he was a vegetable for most of it. If you could speak any language when you woke up from a coma, which one would it be? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and come back soon for another awesome video.